I always thought a really fun game to play would be to approach somebody and mention a really beloved movie musical that most children grow up with, about a father that basically prides himself on being really strict and keeping everything sort of perfectly in line, particularly when he's caring for his children who are looked after by different nannies. But the trouble is that the kids get into so much trouble that the nannies just constantly are getting driven out. But luckily, Julie Andrews drops in and basically brings everybody together and brings happiness to everybody through music and song, just to see which one they think you're talking about. So obviously, this is how I wanted to end the thing we've been doing about the musicals that won Best Picture. Obviously, The Sound of Music being the one here, despite the fact that Mary Poppins really put up a fight against My Fair Lady the year before. Um, yeah, this is what we're gonna do. So actually, even though The Sound of Music is the winner of the two, I think I do want to go back just a year and actually start with Mary Poppins, which came first. Um, so obviously there was the immediate thing in regards to Julie Andrews' involvement in this, to where it was she basically went and did this because she had been denied the role of My Fair Lady for some reason in favor of Audrey Hepburn. So I think I mentioned this in My Fair Lady, but now I've already forgotten. I think it was a whole name issue, basically, how Audrey Hepburn was significantly more recognizable, and Andrews had just done it on the stage. But yeah, I do. But she ultimately ended up winning out anyway because she won the Oscar for this for Best Actress without Hepburn even getting nominated, which may or may not have been bitterness. Everybody feeling a bitterness towards her not getting the role in My Fair Lady. But honestly, maybe she fared better overall anyway. And maybe My Fair Lady's the one that suffered for it, not so much Julie Andrews. So the interesting thing about how this movie begins, and I've been hearing this kind of more so as time goes on. It's really interesting to watch the opening, or like I guess the first 20 minutes or so, really, when she first appears, not including the opening credits. When we see Dick Van Dyke at the very start, and he kind of knows something's coming because there's the change in the wind that he immediately recognizes. Um, and then there's the whole thing where it gets dark and like almost stormy looking, and then she just kind of floats in on her umbrella. And the thing is this is one of the most lovable characters in movie history, but she has since gotten a reputation for the concept almost being a little creepy, because there's even a finely cut thing on YouTube where this was one of the many victims where the movie was recut as like a horror trailer, and it's kind of weird how well it works. Particularly that shot of her first coming down, but yeah, that's immediately put to rest when once she comes down, and even in the opening credits, obviously, like if the opening credits definitely kind of put a rest to that also, because we get to see there's something much more lively and wonderful about this than anything like that. Despite the fact that the boy does end up saying the first thing he says when he sees her is like, "Is it a witch?" They're super happy about the possibility that she's a witch, but still, in any other case, that would be almost horror-like. But yes, immediately once Julie Andrews hits the ground and establishes the character, it's very easy to see why this is one of the most beloved characters ever, really. Um, and the interesting thing about it is, of course, they obviously there's not only is the whole Pale Drivers was way against this movie being made and the changes that were made and stuff like that, but obviously they made an entire movie about it with Saving Mr. Banks. So we pretty much know all that. But one of the first interesting things is the way they've changed the Mary Poppins character, probably much so for the better, because there's the whole thing about in the source material she's much more like strict and like really stone faced about it, whereas the Andrews portrayal of the character makes it much more. While there certainly is that strictness there, there's definitely something much more light about it, and much more fun-loving, which not only seems to really help make the character stand out in a great way, and make her endlessly likable, but also I mean, if you've got to morph it somehow and mold it around this, it certainly fits the whole Disney aesthetic as well. So, um, and yeah, it's just kind of legendary at this point, and it is one of those cases where it's like so beloved. Like the fact that she actually won an Oscar for it is almost one of the last things you think about in regards to how beloved the character and the performance is. But we'll get more into her as we go throughout. One of the things that obviously really stands out is the once again, if you know the P.L. Travers story behind all this, just how incredibly crucial the Mr. Banks character is. Because obviously, in most movies like this, it's, you know, the father's very strict and keeps everything in line, but then eventually he'll get, you know, he'll warm up and then he'll get won over by, you know, the fun and all that. But there's definitely something a little more to this. I mean, it is that, essentially, but it feels like it goes a bit deeper. And is more effective than you typically see this just sort of general trope with this kind of character. Um, Not to mention it being like strongly based on her own father, of course, but also what David Tomlinson brings to it in his performance. Which, interestingly enough, one of the things that he was like really worried about apparently is that, despite going into this like probably the most crucial role in the movie apart from Mary Poppins herself, he couldn't sing going into this, and I guess he was like really sort of been out of shape about that for obvious reasons. But really, I mean, it's not like Rex Harrison and My Fair Lady levels, but it is like it does help the way you see the character. This character in particular kind of eases into his songs. Like he starts off sort of speaking normally, and then it kind of goes into the song. That surely that helped a lot. But the interesting thing here also is that not just necessarily in his performance as Mr. Banks, but the way the movie, and I don't know if this was even the intention or what, or if they were just kind of using the actor to the fullest, but what's kind of interesting that the movie does when you look into it is Tomlinson is also the voice of a few other characters in the movie, whether it be the parrot umbrella or one of the penguins, and I think a couple of other things in the animated sequence. And it's like, if you know Tomlinson also does that on top of being Mr. Banks, there's almost like an underlying playfulness that we know is there if we know that fact, that might not seem to be there in the actual character whenever we see his scenes being as straight as possible as Mr. Banks. I always thought that kind of had an interesting, if possibly unintentional effect like that. Especially since we know he will eventually, you know, tell jokes and fly kites and all that. So, but then there's also the idea of like when he starts to make that transition, when his character starts to change, and there doesn't seem to be like one big giant turning point if you're really watching the performance. It seems to happen kind of gradually, and the scene that really stands out in this way would be the first time they're at the bank, and Michael doesn't want to give up the tummets because of the birds, and he's basically being forced by the bank people to convince Michael to give him this money, and even though he's on the side of the bank people and he's like doing his best to convince Michael this is what he needs to do because it's real life and all that, you get a sense that he doesn't truly believe everything he's saying. Like, there's not really a passion there. It does feel much more like he's being pushed into it by the bank people than him actually trying to convince Michael this is what he should do. So I thought scenes like that really help this character and really flesh him out in a way that's not just, you know, some big sudden turning point, which we typically see with this kind of character turn. So I thought that was really good. And obviously Tomlinson brings that to life in a way that was really crucial to getting this point across. So I really love the way they handled that character. And then, of course, our other really crucial character is Bert, who is Dick Van Dyke. And it's such a shame, because obviously, you know, Dick Van Dyke is just legendary in this. And it kind of sucks that it seems to be the very first thing anybody thinks of when they think of Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins is the accent, and how it's like one of the most ridiculed things like in movie history, because there's just so much he brings to this movie in so many different ways, because there's also really just the way he interacts, not just with all the characters, but particularly the children, and the way that he sort of has this sort of instant connection with them, even though they just kind of come across him. We learned that he like saw them once while they were chasing their kite, but they're not particularly familiar with each other. But he just like immediately becomes this friend of theirs, obviously through the mutual acquaintance that is Mary Poppins. But still, it does feel almost like instant, and so there's this sort of like there's this comfort and familiarity, especially that stands out in the moment when he's like when he finds them in the alley and he's like covered in soot and they don't recognize him at first. But when he says like your old friend wouldn't hurt you, and it's like and they just immediately once they realize it's Bert, like there's just this sudden, oh we're totally safe now. And it's like this is a dude that just kind of walks the streets doing the one man band thing, drawing with chalk. But he just the way he plays the character with such that energy and such that instant likability really makes that believable that he just becomes instant friends with these kids to where they feel this close to him after like one dance sequence inside an animated world or whatever. Um, and there's the very interesting thing they do about his relationship with Mary Poppins. For starters, I do like that P.L. Travers definitely went for do not make a Mary Poppins Bert romance whatsoever, which definitely makes it a lot better. And it's especially when you think about it, and it's like that is so something that Hollywood would have done. That's definitely a change they would have tried to make, but it's very much a relief they didn't go in that direction. Um, and just in general, the whole fact that they have a history that's like almost totally unknown to us. Like we know they know each other, and we know this has probably happened multiple times. Like Mary Poppins going through this whole thing, like coming and going, and the way he instantly recognizes the change in the wind and stuff like that. But the fact that we don't go that far into that, or know like the previous stories or whatever, has always made their relationship also really interesting with that little air of mystery around it. But it's nothing. Because usually when you think of like mystery and something that's not really revealed to us, you think it's almost kind of shady. But here it's just like it's done in a good way to where we can just sense, all the good ways that this goes back and the ways that we will never know. And that this is just like one time this has happened that we witness here. And that just adds a whole kind of magical quality to it that is this whole thing we don't even see. So we don't even know how many times this has probably happened or anything like that. And so on to like, the side characters. Like I wouldn't say the kids are like side characters, but in regards to the action that takes place in the foreground, they are just kind of almost spectators to everything. And they do quite a good job at being like, being like those kids that have reputations and are potential troublemakers, but they're never really that annoying. That's probably a lot due to the fact of Mary Poppins keeping them in check. But, yeah, so I always do appreciate that. And the way that, I was reading somewhere that I guess, a lot of the stuff wasn't told to them, like what was going to happen or what they were going to see. So a lot of their, like, really childlike reactions to some of the magical things that happen and some of the effects, are genuine because they didn't know they were coming. Like, specifically, when you watch the girl's reaction to her pulling the rack out of the bag when she first gets there is, like, something that she did not know was going to happen that way. So that kind of putting that also really adds to how well the kid characters fit into here. Then there's just memorable characters just throughout in like every other scene, like Uncle Albert, and because obviously the I Love to Laugh scene is memorable in itself, not whether it be the song or the tea party or anything. That just the whole scene is just one of the really memorable ones, and it's also one of those cases where ever since Wreck-It Ralph, it's really hard to not think about it when you watch this scene with Alan Tudyk doing that voice that Uncle Albert has for King Candy, and it's like uncanny. So it's like I always kind of associate those characters together forever now. So there's that. Kind of keeping it in the Disney family. Then there's the neighbors. There's Admiral Boom and Mr. Binnacle that just kind of add this, flair to it, quite literally in some cases, throughout, and just have this whole sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Like neighborly quality to it, where it's like all the characters feel like characters we know and have known for a while, even if they've just been introduced. And it just really this community of characters that we grow to love for individual reasons, but also as the whole group together, which is really special. And then of course we have like lately, obviously the musicals we've been talking about have like memorable number after memorable number all the way to the very end, which for actually a lot of musicals can be kind of rare. There's always at least maybe one, two, or even three songs that are just seem to be in there and seem to be like filler, and they're not really that particularly memorable. But this one is relentless. This is absolutely relentless in the very recognizable numbers and the songs that we heard. Even if you didn't like grow up with the movie, these are surely songs that you heard like throughout your life. So they're, or at least heard reference to. Obviously, one that's not just necessarily a musical sequence. There's multiple, but the whole animated sequence that's very long. Is one of the big standout scenes in this movie also, and it's not like it is like amazing to take in, but interesting. But it almost feels like it would have been innovative, but it's not exactly unprecedented. We'd had like almost 20 years before this when Gene Kelly did Anchors Away. There was a similar sequence. So while not necessarily being unprecedented for the time, there's still just something totally crazy. Like I don't know if it's the length of it either, where it's like the more you sort of take it in, and it feels like no matter how long it goes on, it does feel like you're witnessing movie history when you watch this and the way the characters interacted. Even with, like I said, even if it had happened like almost 20 years prior, still the effects feel like, and not necessarily just that, but the way they interact also, particularly the way when Dick Van Dyke dances with the penguins and it's synchronized, seems unreal. And it's like, it's one of those things where it's just like, how do you even accomplish something like that? And that's always been amazing to me. And then there's, and then that obviously takes us into the Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious number, which is insane in a number of ways. Not just the fact that they can sing that word very quickly, but the fact that the whole number is said very, very quickly. Not to mention just the pure insanity that is her saying it in reverse at equal the speed. What she proved on Graham Norton recently that she can still do. So that's always been. And then there's just I say insanity. You want to talk absolute, total insanity, to me anyway, is the entire Step in Time number. And the way it's almost big from the start. Like, there's hardly build up to it, and then as it keeps going, it just gets faster and bigger and just all over the place. One other thing during the Step in Time number that I actually really appreciate that we don't see very often is when we see it from Admiral Boom's perspective. And it's like you see these musicals and you see all these big numbers, but it's so rare that we get to see those numbers take place like from an outside perspective, like from a distance. So I always appreciated that shot. It's always been really funny to me. And then of course, they do have like some nicely done like variations on this. Like not all the numbers are like necessarily really big or really happy or all that. Like there is there's something about the brilliance of a lullaby about staying awake that ultimately does put the children to sleep. That Andrews of course perfected when she sang it. But there's also the way they use music to get to these really big emotional points in different ways, like with or without lyrics. The two that come to mind, of course, are obviously one of the big emotional songs of the movie. Like the song that hits just about anybody is Feed the Birds, with Jane Darwell from The Grapes of Wrath as the homeless lady. Where it just kind of goes into this whole thing about almost seemingly just kind of like right in the middle of it, like almost out of nowhere, but then it has that whole feel of like basically the difference between that and the whole rich lifestyle and basically the lack of generosity and all that, and just the real huge divide between the rich and the poor and all that. But in a really, really like poignant way that doesn't feel like when you describe it like that, it sounds like it's blatantly obvious and all that, and very, surface level and all that. But just the song itself and just how much heart and sadness is in it, like, just really comes through and makes that point. But then there's the scene it's actually probably one of my favorite scenes in the movie, and there's, like, nothing to it. And that is when there's no lyrics, it's just, this, slow, melancholy music, and it's the scene towards the end when Mr. Banks is going back to the bank after Michael's given him the money. And there's nothing big about it. There's no words. We just watch him walk. It almost feels like it's in real time. Just watch him walk all the way to the bank in silence. Despite, the music, obviously. But, I mean, as far as words go, silence. And I thought that's, like, a really powerful moment, especially for his character, and the fact that we kind of sense that it's the build-up to where the character's going to finally make that final turn. To come over to the more fun side of things and kind of get off the whole everybody has to know the seriousness of the world kind of guy that he is. So that's always been a big standout. So obviously you can only say this so many times, but the point still stands. It's one of the most beloved movies out there for sure. I know Disney himself considered it like a crowning achievement. I know Dick Van Dyke apparently actually agrees with a lot of people that he was miscast. I don't know. I think it's kind of hard to imagine this movie without him now at this point, especially after the whole idea of him also playing Dawes Sr. And it's like when he kind of walks in, and you just this whole physicality he's taken over where he's literally on the verge of death, as we learn. But it's like the second you see his eyes, you can tell it's him. And that he took the commitment to also play that character, but he did. I guess he agreed that he was miscast as Bert, but even so, he considered this the best thing he ever did, to my understanding, or does, in present tense still. And then of course, obviously, it got 5 Oscar wins, big Oscar wins with like actress, editing, score, song, and visual effects. Visual effects do obviously look very 60s, but even so, it's still the magic is still there. So. Yeah, and then, as I was saying, just there's so many ways that Andrew just really brought this together, like being the absolute heart of it. Interestingly enough, it is sort of like, usually I would say, and you can't imagine anybody else in the role, but I guess December will tell, but I'm obviously very, very open to what's going to happen in December, and we will see what happens and if the role can live on through another endlessly lovable actress. But I guess we'll find out. I'm actually, like, now that we're kind of revisiting this, I'm actually getting, like, kind of super excited for the sequel, so we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, let's go on to The Sound of Music real quick. Interestingly enough, while The Sound of Music is also considered like one of the most beloved musicals ever made, and not just musicals really, but movies in general, and like Mary Poppins, another movie that people just kind of grow up knowing. I actually didn't grow up with either of these. I kind of had to, but I was always familiar with like the songs and what they were, but it was kind of later in life I had to track them down myself. But the interesting thing when you look into this is the fact that actually, to be totally honest, it's not that surprising, but the fact that the critics were really mixed on it when it first came out, and how they were like, they thought it was like too, overly sentimental or something like that, the shit that critics say, but that obviously didn't stop it from being like it was the highest grossing movie of its year, and for, I don't know, like, I don't really know the top box office, like, all-time lists like that, because they're obviously going to be constantly changing, but to my understanding, it was it was the first movie to pass Gone with the Wind for the highest grossing movie ever, and then it's like, adjusted for inflation, it's like, it is or was like number 5 of all time adjusted for inflation, so obviously there's that whole thing bringing it, but there's also the fact that this is Robert Wise. We started with Robert Wise with West Side Story, now we're going to end on Robert Wise. Just 4 years later, with him winning picture and director again. So, interestingly enough, we're totally changing locations, because you think of the opening of West Side Story, and you think about those shots over the streets of New York and all that, and then eventually going into the first number. And we kind of do the same thing here, but our sets are totally, completely different than the streets of New York now. We're going past, like, mountains and the landscapes and the buildings and, yes, ultimately the hills. And when you see these actual location shots, it's like, it's almost unreal what you're looking at. And it's like, you feel like it has to be, like the fake backgrounds or something like that, but it's just all, and it's just so, it just feels so endless and so vast and so grand, this opening shot, which of course has been parodied since its existence, which hopefully hasn't watered it down too much. I feel like it's still, like, I actually hear that sometimes, but I don't feel like it's watered the impact of the original scene down at all. It's just too big. It's just way too big for any kind of parody to bring it down at all. And then, of course, the way her voice just, like, takes off immediately. It's the first sound we hear, and it's... Yeah, that's just always going to be big. So, and then, yes, as I said before, very similar plot. The kids have been chasing off all the governesses. The last governess lasted 2 hours. So she is coming after she's gotten in trouble one too many times with the nuns, just simply for running off. Nun rules, I guess. So, and eventually meets Christopher Plummer, who is now in the place of the dad that takes things way too seriously, basically runs them like they're in military school, does everything. Of course, he's a single father, so he has an excuse. He has to try, like, significantly harder to keep them in check because he feels like he's basically alone in this, despite all of the governesses and all that. But still is basically alone in it because the governesses keep running off, so, or keep getting pushed out. And you can kind of definitely see that distance, and the great way they show this distance is to make him not an entirely unlikable character, because it's like, these scenes where we see him with the kids, and of course there's, like, this discomfort where he feels like he has to be strict and stuff like that. Much like Mr. Banks would say, like, you know, they have to know the seriousness of the world and stuff like that. But then there are the scenes where you see Von Trapp with other adults, and he seems significantly more comfortable. Seems almost like a completely different person. It's like when you're a kid and you live with your parents and you see them, you interact with them, and then it's this totally different world when you're, like, at gatherings and you see them interact with friends, and it's like you're seeing a totally different person than the parent you know. It kind of gives off that vibe when you see Christopher Plummer with the other adult characters, like the Baroness and stuff like that. And so there's... Yeah, so I feel like they did that really well in regards to not just making him seem like this totally hollow, cruel character, and just nothing else. It's more so just being around the children and trying to raise them that makes him that way, more or less. Which makes it all the more believable when he, too, comes to the character arc of having his heart melted by Julie Andrews, of course. There's obviously, to talk about some of the criticisms that I don't have, but come with the movie when you look into it. There's the whole inaccurate history thing. And it's, I mean, I get it to an extent, because I think it's the whole idea of, like, the way it changes history and all that, and some people took it as, like, the movie was basically trying to take the easy way out and say, like, no matter what bad things are happening in the world, if you just, you know, sing a song or whatever, everything will be alright or whatever. But, I mean, even so, well, number one, I don't think that it's not exactly... I mean, obviously it does seem like a very, very happy movie, and it's known for being, like, one of the happiest movies ever, but at the same time, you know, it does ultimately end with a movie with a family being driven out of their home by Nazis. So it can only be so happy. I know, like, you know, when you go into that area, it is kind of like, you know, when you get into, like, the Nazi area, it is like being driven out of your home is, like, probably one of the, you know, least horrible things that could possibly happen. But even so, I don't think the movie completely tries to go completely over that or completely past that the way it's been accused of sometimes. And just in general, in regards to inaccurate history, it's like, yes, people, this was the first movie to be historically inaccurate, and it was the last movie to be historically inaccurate, for sure. No. Just, it's that, obviously, that as long as the movie tells its story, that's something that I don't particularly get too bent out of shape about, so, and then there's the whole thing about, Critics love... If critics don't like a movie that's beloved, especially by people that know it from their childhood, their immediate defense is people only like it because of nostalgia, which just pisses me off to no end. And I can't use that because I didn't grow up with this. I probably saw this the first time when I was 14 or 15, maybe? I know technically that could still count as that, but I still think that's... I mean, I did grow up with some of it. Like, in music class we were taught, like... usually people watch it in music classes. Despite the fact that we watched West Side Story, we did not ever actually watch this in full, but we did learn, Do Re Mi and a few other songs. But, even so, it does feel like... It feels so lazy, kind of, to just assume, like, instead of really trying to go into a movie, and so, even if you don't like it, go in and really try to understand why somebody likes something, but instead you want to be really dismissive and say, like, oh, people just like it because of nostalgia and stuff like that, and I have no interest in hearing what else they have to say about it. And that's just, that's really just not the way you should do that. Like, just the way the other people should listen to the criticism, the people criticizing, people will have, they will have plenty of things to hear from people who love it for what it is, in great detail, surely. And then, and because they also, like, you know, they use the word, like, sugary and stuff like that, which is just... Number one, it's one of those cases where you just feel like somebody heard somebody use the word sugary to describe a sentimental movie, and then they just kind of hear that and then just leech off of it whenever the movie's brought up to make it sound like they have an original thought. And it just sounds like, just the word sugary just pisses me off, because it's like, it just sounds like a pathetic attempt at cynicism, which just is just so fucking transparent, and it just drives me crazy. So, and I'm not even that incredibly passionate about The Sound of Music, if we're being honest. I like it quite a bit, but just whenever I hear those kind of criticisms, like I said, there is definitely some legit criticism in there. But I just, yeah, oftentimes it just feels very lazy, and it's like they don't want to understand the many reasons why people do still love this movie, why it's still as beloved as it is, why it's still considered one of the best musicals ever, and to a lot of people one of the best movies ever. So, yeah, and also one of the other things that I just like to put to rest is, another criticism I hear quite often is that the romance between Lisa and Rolf doesn't go anywhere, or that it's pointless, that it drags the movie out. Well, for starters, 16 going on 17 is probably one of the most memorable scenes in the movie, at least to me. It was definitely one of the ones I remembered pretty vividly around the time that I saw it. You've got not just the words and their romance, but you've got like the dancing and the rain and that whole set and all that. But that's the thing, though, is that what I really love about this is it just comes off at the start as just a teen romance. That's what the whole song is about. Is just, hey, we're like really young and everything, but we're like so in love. And you do think they're just gonna leave it at that, but there's hardly any alluding to the fact of just how incredibly crucial this romance is going to be. Did all these people criticizing this miss the end of the movie by any chance? Where they're trying to leave, and they're sneaking out, they're almost there, and then who is the one that catches them but Rolf? And they've been caught. This is where the movie could take an absolutely dark, bleak turn. And then Rolf sees Liesl there, and is like, okay, well, I've got to alert this, but I'm going to give them time to go because I love her. And they get away, and as they're getting away, he says, hey, found them. But because of this, they were able to get away. Remind me again where this development is pointless, and where it doesn't belong, and where it shouldn't be in the movie. Yes. So, sometimes teen romance can be shoehorned in. It can be, you know, unbelievable. It can be a bit annoying, if the characters are. Or it can save the day. And obviously we know where it went in this direction. So, going on that also, as I said, there's just memorable number after memorable number. What's interesting here also is that each song has, like, such a different sound and meaning. I kind of talked about that in Mary Poppins, but it's really noticeable here, especially with the way it sort of, not only does it get like different things out of the audience with each number, and it's saying something in a different context, but like some of the numbers can be like really, really close together. Like my favorite things in Do Re Mi are like literally one right after the other, and in another musical that would seem like maybe a bit one too many songs and we're getting way too much in one area. But these just flow so nicely, and they just have they have different kind of connotations to where they are in the story and what they mean for the characters as they sing them. It all does make sense, and the way these songs come back later. Also, an even bigger example would be The Lonely Goatherd being almost immediately followed by Edelweiss. Talk about, like, probably the two most different numbers in the movie are, like, one right after the other. And like I said, just have two totally different places in this story saying two totally different things. Even the songs like that aren't as big or grand or memorable in regards to what we're looking at, the songs still are, like So Long Farewell, that whole number where they're like on the steps and they like leave the party and all that. Not the most memorable in regards to musical numbers, but the song still obviously absolutely has stood the test of time. So even if it seems to kind of falter in one place, it's still really big in another way, particularly in the whole history of it. And then there's the way they're able to use the songs without being... they can be incredibly emotional, but despite the fact that the movie's known for being so sentimental, it doesn't feel like it's overdoing it in some of these really big emotional scenes where it could have. Like when he hears them singing, and he goes in and everybody's watching them, and it's like, when he talked about that moment of they brought music back into the house. And that says the whole thing about the history of this character and where he's coming from, and that sort of being put off by emotions up to this point. And then when he starts singing along with them, the way they look at him just says everything, and there's no words necessary except for the song. And it's yeah, even when it's a reprise, and there's even speaking of the reprises, there is other places where another thing where I feel like there's definitely a contrast between the how happy the movie is for most of it, and that would be when we get a lot of the songs and they've got their happy context and all that, and then we go to the end and we know that this musical performance is going to be followed by a very intense pursuit of them by the Nazis as they attempt to escape. So as they're singing these songs again that were so happy in the first half of the movie, now have this really dark context, almost like it's like a countdown clock as these songs go now, and you can feel that there's just something so uncomfortable underlying to where this could be, the last time they do something like this or something, and it's... So yeah, the movie does not completely skip over some of the bleakness. It may not go fully into it the way I guess critics wanted, but but it doesn't skip over it. That whole dark quality to it is there under the surface, if you just feel it. And then, like I said, talking about these just these sets really, and how a lot of, obviously the scenes in the movie are going to stand out a lot more, the ones that are set outdoors. Despite the fact that we do have some of these, really nice sets, it's just when we're on the outside, when they're first introduced to the Baroness, it's just the backdrops just seem massive, and even scenes that are just, just dialogue, just saying, here, meet this person, but you just got this massive backdrop of these mountains and hills in the background, and it's just everything feels like it's so big, even when what's happening to the characters really isn't. And also going on visuals, there's also stuff some of the way the camera moves or the way the edits work. One that really stands out is the wedding scene when they're getting married, and then it pans up the wall of the church, and then while still doing that, while hardly breaking that pan up, suddenly we're outside and it's an exterior shot of the church still going in that direction. That's an amazing That's an amazing edit, so that's something that's always stood out to me also, where it's not necessarily just the settings and the backdrops and all that that make this sort of visually appealing, but the way the camera can move or the way they do a certain edit can just really make it stand out in a big way and really say something about what we're looking at, too. Um, Obviously, unlike Mary Poppins, I feel like Mary Poppins is sort of like, well, I do think the animated sequence is a bit too long. Like I said, it does feel like every frame of it we're looking at some kind of piece of movie history and something that really stands out. Um, I do feel like The Sound of Music is done in a little bit by its length. Sound of Music is one of those movies that does feel like you can feel the weight of it on you as it goes. As we get closer towards the climax, of course, it does really, especially when it finds that dark territory, it does really come back. But there is like a stretch there. Like the thing is obviously there's more to the story, absolutely, because the Nazis have already been brought into this, but it feels a lot like it could end when Maria returns, because there is like if you would take the intermission out of it too, obviously, because it's just at the 2-hour mark when she comes back. It's this big triumphant moment. It's immediately followed up, like we're led into it by this big performance of Climb Every Mountain, which I am pretty sure is like Peggy Wood got an Oscar nomination for supporting actress. Undoubtedly, Climb Every Mountain did that for her single-handedly. And that's a really big moment also, so it does feel like it actually could have had an ending right there. But there's still like 55 minutes left. And when they go into the whole getting married and then when they return and all that, it does feel like the length is really starting to weigh down. Like I said, it does pick itself back up for the climax, which is great. So there is that. And of course, it too won 5 Oscars, being picture, director, editing, score, and sound. Very, in regards to the technical, very close to what Mary Poppins also scored. Obviously, I was talking about how Mary Poppins got beat in most of its categories by My Fair Lady. Sound of Music's big competition, pretty much every category, every technical category that The Sound of Music lost, it lost to Dr. Zhivago. And there is always that kind of thing to where it's like, would have Julie Andrews won for this had she not just won the previous year for Mary Poppins? That's kind of hard to say. It was Julie Christie for Darling, which they also, you would say probably, but when you look at Julie Christie's victory, the Academy really loved Darling too, with it getting a picture nomination and Schlesinger getting in for director. Julie Christie may have always happened, even if Julie Andrews hadn't won the year before. But then again, Sound of Music was the picture winner. It's really, really hard to say. It's really tough to call. Because also, when you look at Oscar history, there's always that thing to where it's like, there's often times where a legendary performance was nominated and lost to a performance that may not be as well known now. It happens all the time. So there's a good chance it was always going to be Julie Christie, but yeah, we'll just always have that question. So I think that's about all I have to say about these. I do think I very slightly prefer Mary Poppins, because I feel like it doesn't quite have that downtime to where it's like, it feels like there's a weight on you for how long it is, the way The Sound of Music starts to after a while. And I guess they're both relentless in regards to the numbers, but I do think ultimately Mary Poppins, in regards to musically, probably stands out just a little bit more, to where some of the numbers are just a bit more well done, a bit more catchy and all that, a bit more emotional. So yeah, but I don't know if it comes down to emotional. The battle between the Feed the Birds number and when Plummer starts singing and comes together with the kids through the music in that scene. So it's a lot of beautiful stuff here. But yeah, if I had to choose one, it would be just very slightly by a hair. So yes, okay. So we have finally finished this. Next week, actually, by the time you see this, probably in the next few days or so. My brother and I are doing the big Marvel Cinematic Universe versus, so we'll get to go through all that. And then reviews coming up are going to be Christopher Robin and First Reformed with Ethan Hawke. So got that to look forward to, and then we'll see what happens through August, taking us to the end of the summer, and then award season will be coming, so that'll be fun. And then, yeah, so we'll be starting the award season stuff at the end of this month, so that's going to be fun. So, until all that stuff,